Well, here we are. I mean, I don't know really about a geography lesson tonight, and I'm sure you know it much better than I do, but this is sort of how the Europeans saw North and South America, and Canada in some ways is quite similar in the sort of mirror situation with Brazil, although you're sort of south and warm and we're north and cold. But basically, North America first was a source of raw materials for Europeans. They came and got beaver furs to keep themselves warm. They came and hunted whales to make blubber, to make oil from the blubber. That was the Portuguese, the Basques. Obviously, the Portuguese came and fished. So there's tremendous, it's called the Grand Banks, tremendous fishing. And so these were people coming to take things away and not necessarily settle in Canada. I'm not sure if it was the same for Brazil. Maybe later you can tell me about that. But basically, Canada was a tremendous source of various raw materials for Europeans. The country, unlike Brazil, the country really was relatively easy to take hold of and to navigate and settle because there's a fantastic river system, St. Lawrence River. Montreal is right on the St. Lawrence, and then a Great Lakes water system. So you can see that settlers could basically make it all the way, almost halfway into the continent to take possession of the land, and then from there move north and south if they wanted to. Even from New York, boats can go up what's called the Hudson River and trade or get materials that come from the Midwest. Chicago is here. So the Great Lakes presented a great opportunity for the development of North America and Canada. And because of the weather and the geography, Canada essentially is developed in a very, very strong east-west fashion. This thing's probably not going to last very long. It's already gone. It'll be good if I don't point, perhaps, anyway. Except I do need it for changing the slides. And you'll get there when we talk about Montreal on tomorrow. Montreal happens to be at a very, very crucial point in the waterway system in that the river is no longer navigable after Montreal because of major rapids. And so there had to be a transfer of goods and whatnot at that point. Subsequently, in the 50s, they built the seaway, so now boats can get all the way, ferry boats can get all the way to the far Midwest. So Montreal, that was a critical moment in thinking about Montreal, because Montreal was the major Canadian city up until the seaway, mainly because that's where things had to be exchanged. Once the seaway got built, gradually the power and domination of Montreal in Canada was taken over by Toronto. Perhaps you know this already, but Canada is made up of provinces. Provinces are like states. Just not quite sure why they're called provinces versus states, but they're called provinces. Montreal is in Quebec. Toronto is in Ontario. Vancouver is the big city in British Columbia. And we'll show some work also that you'll see in Newfoundland and Labrador later in the show. And yes, Eduardo and Neil come from Winnipeg, which is here. We call it Winterpeg. Winterpeg. So when you see Eduardo or when you see Neil, you can joke around that they come from Winterpeg because it's very cold, very, very cold there. So, this is, of course you've seen this before, I'm sure. This is typical. This is probably Montreal, but it might not be Montreal. But this is something in the winter, not every day, but once in a while you come out and you have to get your car and go to a meeting. So you can imagine that you need to clean it off, shovel a little bit on the side so that you can drive out. We have a thing called winter tires. They have big, made of rubber that allows you to roll a little bit in this stuff. And you walk in shoes or boots and cross the street and have to be careful and things like that. Just basically, it's fun though, if you're not, stressed about anything. The kids love it. And that's Toronto, actually, a picture of Toronto. They have a very nice, Toronto has a very nice old, that's a modern one, but an old tram system. And then people do things that are fun, like skating. This is in Ottawa where they clean off. They don't have to freeze it. It's already freezing itself. They clean off the canal, and you could even skate to work. Like you ride your bicycle to work, supposedly you could skate because it's 5 or 10 miles long and whatnot. And then we have, I'm only showing a couple of seasons because summer, everybody knows what summer looks like. For us, the fall, this is funny because the colors, the trees were beautiful in Brasilia, but this is not flowering, this is actually dying. The leaves change color when the days become too short, and you have a very phenomenal season of color. It's short, but it's quite beautiful. And then I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about this sort of fantasy with nature. Obviously, we have a country that has fantastic natural landscape, and we had a terrific group of artists called the Group of Seven that are kind of the sort of paradigm of Canadian art from the early 20th century. This is Tommy Thompson. It's called It's called the Jack Pine. A fabulous painting of nature. And then the guy that I actually like the most in that group, because I think he's the most architectural, this is Lauren Harris. I'll show you a few paintings of his. I liked these a lot when I was a student, basically making, and they even named them quite often cathedral or something like that. So these are up in the north. He's painting icebergs. Yes, sure. This is Lauren Harris. The previous painting was Tommy Thompson. He unfortunately died in a canoe accident that is very mysterious and quite controversial, because he was found in the water, but he had fishing line around his legs. So, not very funny, but anyway. But they don't know exactly what happened. Anyway, so Lauren Harris is in this group of seven, and I think for an architect, there's some very wonderful imagery of transforming mountains and icebergs into kind of an architectural fetish in a way. Even the clouds become kind of architectural. And then, like I said, Canadians are very fond of their landscape, so even on our $20 bill, this is a famous Lake Louise. It's called Lake Louise in the Rockies, not too far from Calgary, is the popular image that was on the 20. I don't know if it still is. I think they changed the money since then. And interestingly, for the development of the country and for architecture was the train, obviously. The train was from the British, especially the British are very strong in building railroads, as you probably know, from India and elsewhere, and they built the railroad across Canada from east to west. There's a very funny movie, I was going to show it, but you could look it up. I'll try to write down the name. It was with Buster Keaton. They actually did a very cute little 24-minute movie called, I forget what it's called, but you can look it up on the internet. Just type in Buster Keaton, and he basically goes across Canada. But the interesting thing with the railroad was then they used architecture to promote Canada and promote sightseeing and holidays and making money, obviously. And so Canadian Pacific, the railroad, started to build hotels. So this is basically, you have the railroad, and the railroad is functional for moving grain and goods, but then they also decided to, in some very fantastic places, build hotels to try to promote the use of the train for sightseeing and holidays. So you have a whole series of wonderful posters from probably the beginning of the century showing that you can go on the train, you could see the Indians, you could, I don't know what, go swimming, go to Toronto, the big image of the Royal York, or go to Quebec and have the French holiday. And so they, obviously architecture becomes this kind of tool for promotion of the economy of the railroad and holidays. And the architecture is something that has to work with that idea of the dream vacation and the dream landscape. So the architecture is very castle-like or chateau-like projects in very fantastic landscapes. This is Banff Springs. Here you are for a holiday. You go to the hotel, and then you could go for a horseback ride in the mountains. Another one of their hotels at the foot of the mountain. This is the Banff Springs Hotel. When I was a student, I almost worked on the golf course there. I stopped and got a job, but it was only for like $1 an hour. So I said, I'm kind of on I need to make money in Canada. You know, with students, you need to make as much as you can when it's a summer vacation. So $1 an hour was not a good idea. I went to work. As a matter of fact, I went to work on the railroad, shoveling.
And those places are accessible to everyone or only rich people?
I've never stayed there, but I think you could. But you know, it's a little bit pricey. No, I've never stayed there. Yeah, they're in the higher end, let's just say. But they're not. You know, like the Royal York. This is the fantastic image of Toronto. You know, the train station is right here. Union Station. This is in Toronto, the Royal York Hotel. The Union Station is the main station, is right there. You come out, and there is this fantastic, modern kind of chateau type building. Nowadays, you might get a room that you could, because it's kind of an old hotel now, but it's still, on the high end. And then, of course, the whole sort of the idea for an English Canadian to go to old Quebec, sort of you're going to the Chateau Frontenac is, the whole image of the chateau, and obviously, the family would be all excited to be going to this place. Whoops! And there it is in the fall. It's a beautiful hotel, and
How many rooms are there?
huh?
How many rooms are
How many rooms?
there? Thousand.
I have no idea. I don't. But it stops here. This is a cliff. This is a cliff, and this is the lower part of Quebec City. It's quite a beautiful city. I don't know, man. It's a good question. We can Google it. Google it. The Chateau Frontenac. And then this is, I think this is Banff Springs for real. It's got some real pictures versus the cartoons. Again, you know, it's idyllic. This, I think, is in Victoria, British Columbia, the Empress. And that's the Royal York in Toronto. And this is the $20 bill, the Lake Louise that you saw on the money. That's the Chateau Laurier in Ottawa. The Parliament buildings are here. Canada's government buildings are right here, and this is right beside it. So it's all, you know, part of the whole ambiance. And the other thing with the train, obviously, is the real industrial logic of the train, and it's I think one of the most powerful architectural images of Canada is the use of the train to move grain. And the train obviously was the most economical way and efficient way to move things across the country. And even Le Corbusier, as you all know, right? Everybody knows Le Corbusier was a fanatic about the pure beauty of the grain elevator, the concrete silos. He wrote about it in Towards a New Architecture. You all read that? What did he say? He said the American engineers overwhelmed with their calculations our expiring architecture. So he's making that statement that the pure engineering beauty of the grain silo is much more impressive than all of the stylistic concerns of Art Nouveau and other types of architecture that he wanted to move beyond. So when you go out to the west, you have these fantastic wooden structures. Tall wooden structures. Wood. They might have some steel inside, I'm not sure, but I think they started out as wood. And they're very tall, and the grain is piled in at the top somehow, and from the train comes, and then they have these kind of tubes that come out and fill the train with the grain. So all of the communities, each community, you'll see each of the communities has its name on it, and there's a kind of a partnership. This is in the prairies. The prairies are the provinces that were in the middle, from Winnipeg to Saskatchewan to Alberta. You drive and it's flat. You drive for 16 hours and you don't hit a bump. It's very boring. But they have these terrific structures that identify each of the towns along the way because of the local. And it's a very socialist. There is a lot of socialism or socialist thinking in the west of Canada or the prairie provinces because they grew the grain and they shared the sales amongst themselves. They didn't, it wasn't one farmer selling. So that's why you have this co-op, it's called. And then the more famous ones or more important ones were then when you get to the Great Lakes from those smaller wooden ones in the towns, then you got to the Great Lakes. For example, I don't really want to go back to the map, but just to be simple, I don't even know what Canada looks like anymore, but so basically all those little houses are here, and then they get to the Great Lakes. So those structures started happening quite far in the western end of Ontario, for example. And you get these fabulous structures that then transferred from the train to boats. So the boats would pull up, and the boats come up, and again the same sort of thing happens. They fill huge basins, and then the boats go off to. I mean, Canada is selling grain to Russia and all over the world, so it is an important industry.
600.
600, it's small. It's a good size. Yeah. This one, I think, is in Buffalo. I'm not sure. But they're fabulous structures, and they have these incredible, these very interesting bridges and things like that. This is in Montreal, and this is actually not functional any longer. The sad thing is they knocked a lot of them down, too. It's very sad. But this one they've left up, it's called Grain Silo Number 5 in Old Montreal. And they've had competitions to say, what can we do? I think that you should build some stairs and some elevators and let people play on it, like a landscape, But you know how people want to be able to fill it with function, and you're never going to fill this thing with function. So, but nobody wants to think outside the box. Maybe it's just an interesting thing to climb on. It doesn't have to work all the time. And then there's you have this great mix of materials, because then you'll have the lighter structures. You'll have the lighter structures on the top in steel and whatnot. But here you get this image of a functioning one, where basically they fill with these troughs the grain. And then some terrific signage also. This is in Montreal. 5 roses, it's called. Farine. 5 roses. Farine is flour. So from the train to from the artist, I wanted to go from the artist to the landscape, to the train, and then talk a little bit about. First, I'm going to talk about an architect named Arthur Erickson. Arthur Erickson is a little bit like our Niemeyer in a lot of ways. A terrific architect. If you look him up, you'll see very, very beautiful. He was especially known for very beautiful houses in the mountains, in the country. I didn't want to present that necessarily today, but you should look that up. What I'm presenting today is more his larger structures that work with the bigger landscape. This is a picture from the university building that he did in basically the master plan and the main buildings for Simon Fraser University outside of Vancouver, where you're on top of a plateau overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and the main architectural gesture that Erickson did was to create this quadrangle as the main kind of civic space of the university. And then we're going to see from the quadrangle is this terrific glass and wood and steel roof that covers an outdoor space. British Columbia is a different climate. I should specify that. It's not like Montreal. It's an oceanside climate, so it's a little more temperate. The winter gets down to maybe 0. There's not as much snow as Toronto and Montreal. So this idea of that's also what really is embracing in Erickson's architecture, is that it really is closer to what you are used to, an architecture that is incredibly open to the climate, and works both outdoor spaces and indoor spaces in a kind of a seamless and very rich way. So this main outdoor space, you would never get this, rarely you get something like this in eastern Canada. This great outdoor space covered by the glass roof. And I don't have a lot of good pictures of it, but a very interesting truss system of steel and wood. The wood on the bottom as the tension cord, and skylights on the top. And Erickson was very, very strong with the use of landscape and landscaping elements in his architecture. Probably a lot like Niemeyer, using a good landscape architect in his work with him as a collaborator. This is a very famous museum that he did in Vancouver, which of course now when I'm talking about it, I'm forgetting the name, but it's for Indian. It's for the Indian civilization. There's totem poles and all kinds of beautiful, beautiful artifacts. And again, you see his architecture is very, very simple, strong structural ideas. That is the theme carried all the way through. A typical image I want to present as we get towards the next project of Erickson, of the train trestle. This is how the trains cross valleys. I imagine that it's an image that you've seen before. And then in a place called Lethbridge, Alberta, in this very, very, very interesting kind of landscape. This is where the prairies just start to, the prairies arrive, and then you're going to get to the Rockies. Before they get to the Rockies, they do this kind of wobbling, and they produce these very, very interesting little ravines. And Erickson, you'll see in the next image, comes to this site and builds a university building across one of these valleys. Very powerful, like a beam, just going across Lethbridge University. I don't have a lot of good images of it, but it's in that style, and we'll see another one where the section is very, very strong. The whole project is built on the idea of this extruded section. So the stepping section is pulled right across this valley, and it creates some larger, important public spaces in the building. Continuing the theme of the sort of, I wanted to kind of show you some exaggerations and extremes in dealing with the Canadian context of the geography. So we saw Erickson with some of his very big public buildings. If you have time, you could see some of his houses, which are terrific explorations of again, at a smaller scale, the mix of landscape and architecture at the domestic scale. So it's very, very beautiful, beautiful work. But at the domestic scale, I decided I would bring you to the far east of Canada. This is Nova Scotia, which is in the Atlantic. And there's an architect in Nova Scotia named Brian McKay-Lyons, who I think plugs into this kind of notion of really trying to establish an architecture that that profits and makes a major statement because of where it is. It's not about the complexity of the building or the complexity of the building form. I think what Brian McKay-Lyons does is establishes some very simple things and plays with the contrast between the purity of his architectural gesture and the complexity and richness of the landscape. So, sometimes the images are maybe a little bit simplistic. I'm not putting, or I wouldn't put Brian McKay-Lyons at the two series of projects that I'm presenting right now are not really meant to be in any way comparisons to Ericsson, because the Ericsson's architecture is so much more elaborated. But in a more contemporary fashion, there's this simple, minimalist contrast with something that is already incredibly rich. That is in Nova Scotia. That's Brian McKay Lyons. And he's a contemporary. Brian McKay Lyons. And then, continuing again, I'm not, like I said, I'm not really going detail into their architecture, but I just wanted to show you this kind of fascination with landscape. I'll write his name down before we get there. There's a very, that was me. There's a quite an interesting little island. Now we're getting very exotic here. This is called Fogo Island. This is Newfoundland, which Newfoundland is sort of like, for me, like Patagonia is to Argentinians, or to you. It's like way out there. So that's in Newfoundland. Fogo Island is this place where some art lover is developing sort of ecotourism, with hotel and small artist studios. And first she brought artists in the studios, and now it's become so popular that people are going to Fogo Island. And I don't know the story, I don't know where this comes from, but this guy, who is Canadian but lives in Norway, Todd Saunders is doing this kind of very sort of contemporary. This is actually, I should have started with the small things, but he's doing, I'll come back to that in a second. He's started by doing these kind of funny little, I don't have any good slides of these things, but he's doing these little funny little studios and guest houses. Started with those, and then it became so popular that they decided they would try to build in a similar style this kind of hotel. I don't think they quite got it with the hotel, but it's it's interesting. On this again, this sort of idea that this landscape is so fundamentally incredible, you don't really have to do architecture. You can just throw a box on the ground and it would be really neat. So that's kind of what that architecture is about. And again, it is a climate and a landscape that is quite exciting to imagine spending some time in. Nicer like that, though. So that's it for the kind of landscape and architecture in Canada. Sort of a little bit of an overview. Now I'm going to show you a few kind of highlights. I call them the icons of Canadian architecture. In North America, more than South Americans are probably much more, because of the concrete tradition and whatnot, much more influenced by the architecture of Le Corbusier. Whereas in North America, especially in Canada, corporate architecture and the architecture of the 50s and that was much more influenced by Mies. I don't think we'll see too many buildings like this in Sao Paulo, but steel is used a lot in North America, as opposed to concrete. Concrete is used for the structural foundations of a building, and then quite often we get a little bit lighter as we go up. And this is a terrific, for sure it's a second generation Miesian building. I'm not saying that this is such a unique building, but it is quite a beautiful train station, a small train station in Ottawa, the central station for Ottawa, done by a man named John Parkin, and it's still there. I think it's a really nice building. This is really just jumping around. It was interesting. It was kind of like scratching my head of what buildings I liked when I traveled, and through different generations, not just contemporary. This is a very interesting. This is a student residence at the University of Alberta by two guys, Barton Myers and Jack Diamond. And what's really nice about it, I mean, the idea of an atrium building is not unique. This was a period when, because in our climate, this is a good place to be in January. So for the students, it was a very interesting building that they took this typology, which is very unresidential in our climate. Rarely would you see a building, I mean, even here, you don't usually put residential buildings in an interior space. But here, because it was student residences, the rooms go through to the wall outside, so they have natural ventilation on the other side, but the students can all open up these colored shutters and participate with friends in that in a kind of a central space where they have little restaurants and whatnot down at the bottom. It's called the Hub, H-U-B, and I don't have a picture. It's one of those buildings from the 60s, 70s that doesn't really have an outside that you can remember. It does, but it's kind of banal. And of course, you probably all know the Toronto City Hall. The Toronto City Hall was an international competition in the 50s, and it was won by a Norwegian architect named Viljo Revel. And Revel, his scheme, I come from Toronto, so this is like my early image of architecture was this building, the two towers with the chamber in the middle, and then all the public spaces and whatnot on the ground floor. I think it's a terrific building. It has a very, very active, wonderful plaza in front. I don't have a picture of it, but the famous skating rink is out in front. It's a fountain. It's a fountain in the summer, and then it's a skating rink in the winter, and it's a very popular place for people to go and skate. It's a terrific building, the Toronto City Hall. From that similar period of Arthur Erickson, the kind of brutalist university building, this is John Andrews, who was Australian, an Australian architect who came to Canada to settle for a while and won some competitions and some important jobs. And like I said about the Lethbridge building, I didn't bring the section with me, but this is one of those buildings that's designed in section, and kind of the section is stretched across the face of a cliff kind of, or a hillside. So the same section is going around, probably changes over here, and you have some special events in the corners. Scarborough College, that's in Toronto. And of course there are the great Mies buildings. This is the Toronto Dominion Centre in Toronto, with a fabulous banking hall that anybody could go and have their bank account. And then two towers. I think this is somebody else that came along later. I believe that and this are the composition. That thing came from somebody else. Another architect from the 50s and 60s that was a small master was this guy named Ron Thom. This is a university in Peterborough, Ontario, called Trent. And Ron Thom's architecture is very rich and detailed. not excessively outstanding in terms of the exterior formal qualities, but you can tell that there's a lot of care in his architecture. A Native American Indian, Douglas Cardinal, made his name. This was in Alberta, called the St. Mary's Cathedral, with a terrific kind of, and this has to be seen, you know, at the same time as somebody's doing Mies, or somebody's doing, well, mostly Mies at that time. So this is very unique and being done as a individual research program, if you will. He went on to become the architect of the Musée de Civilisation outside of Ottawa, and it's it's one of those things where a guy did this incredible organic architecture, but then many years later, given a huge mandate, was stretched, I think, to do a building that's not really that interesting. It's unfortunate. It's not a very interesting building, but this was a terrific building, St. Mary's. Then we have, then postmodernism hit. This is a competition in the middle 80s for the Mississauga City Hall, and it is built. It is a building by Edward Jones, who's a British architect, came to Canada and established a partnership, and they won, I forget his partner's name, but they won this competition. And James Stirling, if you know James Stirling's architecture, this was very, very, very James Stirling at the time, and James Stirling was on the jury. So, I mean, this is terrible now. It's sad to say, but at the time it was like bang on. But the funny thing is, competitions are quite often like that. The Toronto City Hall, Eero Saarinen was on the jury. So the famous story is that Eero Saarinen picked the project out of the garbage pile and said, "What about this one?" I mean, that's a story for Sydney, I think. Anyway, this is another one that doesn't stand for very long. This is the Kitchener City Hall, another competition won by a group called KPMB, who are a very big firm in Toronto. Very successful firm. But again, some of the iconic images from the 80s no longer really holds interest. And similarly, this is going to be a small little anecdotal digression that I wanted to introduce to this evening's discussion. In Toronto, Libeskind was invited to do a museum. This is called the Royal Ontario Museum. And, it is a very striking building in that, I think it's a silly building, but it's a very striking building. And the subject I wanted to bring up with this kind of, it doesn't necessarily affect you right now. I'm not sure my colleagues will have something to say. This whole aspect of star architecture, unfortunately, has taken over in cities like Toronto. Toronto has this desire to be a major international city, so it goes out and it gets Libeskind, it goes out and it gets Gehry, there's Foster buildings, and I want to bring up a discussion with you about that because I really feel that it's an unfortunate thing. Sort of a small little sub-theme I wanted to introduce in this presentation was about deglobalizing and trying to withstand the pressures of this kind of architecture. This is Frank Gehry. There are some striking things about this. This is the Ontario Art Gallery in Toronto. There are some pretty striking images in the building. I'm not saying Frank Gehry is not a great architect, and there's a fantastic circulation space in the building. But this aspect of the building, and this is really the part of the building that counts, a huge glass pavilion strewn across a main street with no entrances, with steps up to an empty portico. A terrible, terrible piece of urban architecture from my point of view. Terrible piece of urban architecture. But, people will talk about the wood glue lamp beams that this space is made of. Totally useless space. It's basically a hallway attached to the front of the original building. They have like a cafe or something. It's 100 meters long, and they have a cafe. It's hard to understand when this might be interesting, but this is really kind of stupid. It's the back of the gallery. It's just a big box, and then the circulation space is quite beautiful, and he's a very skillful architect. This is a very interesting, we'll come back to the deglobalized discussion, but this is a very interesting building. This is by a British architect, so it's not necessarily a critique of what I just brought up. This is a smaller British architect named Will Alsop, who has done a lot of mediocre architecture. He's an architect that has this very exuberant and striking kind of caricatural style. But in this case, I think it was a great project. It's an extension to a school of design. And instead of kind of filling a site, this is the old school of design, he basically popped up on stilts studio space. It's just dumb studio space. It's a cheap building. It's just a steel box with some small windows. But he's made quite an interesting urban and exciting gesture that works at the scale of the city. It's intricate. It's got a nice lobby. And, you can be critical of lots of things in the building, but I think this building is an interesting piece of architecture that is made for Toronto. Whereas in the other cases, I think the problem is they're taking work away from people that might do some very interesting work. And there are architects in Canada, just like there are architects here, who can do wonderful work, given the opportunity to do it. Yeah, that's... That is called OCAD, which is Ontario College of Art and Design. And the architect is named Will Alsop. He's a British architect. For example, you might know, I went to see a library outside of London. It was pretty nice. I think this project is nicer, but pretty nice library. These are the Pat Cows. You might have heard of the Pat Cows. They're kind of one of Canada's most well-known contemporary architects. This is a project from the 80s or 90s. It's an older project called the Canadian Clay and Glass Museum in Waterloo, Ontario, but it was one of the first buildings that really put them on the map in Canada. They're very crafty, very interesting, simple exploration of planimetric and sectional, especially sectional, very interesting sectional work in their projects. This is a school, I don't have a lot of slides, this is called Seabird School outside in British Columbia. It's, again, like other architects in Canada, working with a fantastic landscape. This is a local architect in Montreal named Eric Gauthier, building a tiny, tiny theater on a very, very, very small site called Katsu. And then you have there's a Chinese architect, I forget his name, who did these towers in Mississauga called the Maryland Towers. So my point is that, every country needs to have, and every community needs to have, I think, the confidence that their architecture, when I go into the bookstore here and I see this guy, what was his name? Artigas. It's not just all Niemeyer. There's so many other guys who are doing terrific work, and that's the same thing in Canada. There's people doing terrific work, and this whole notion of hiring international stars they're not giving you international the quality work anymore. A Foster building is done by who knows who does a Foster building, or a piano building. They're just dumb buildings nowadays, and it's unfortunate that it's a total kind of commercial thing. My son was laughing because he said that nobody's going to understand. The hockey team in Vancouver are called the Canucks. Canuck is a Canadian. Canadian, I think it's an Indian word. So Canadian is a Canuck. So if you ever, and then you might have seen there's a very warm coat called Canuck. Yeah, I think it's a play on it. But Canuck, so if you meet again, when you see Eduardo, or especially Neil, you say, "Hey, you crazy Canuck." He's going to they're going to "What are you talking about?" Anyway, they'll laugh. They will laugh. Huh? Canucks. Anyway, this is the reason why I'm saying that this whole evening is kind of strangely interrelated, is when I was thinking about showing you the railroad and the hotels and the landscape, and I was going to show the Buster Keaton film, but I didn't. I realized that I went on this trip myself. This idea of going all the way from the east to west is a kind of a mythical thing to do in Canada. Now, I don't know if it's possible here to do such a thing. Maybe going up the Amazon is your version of going across Canada. But this fellow invited Neil. In fact, Neil was on this trip too. And this fellow in Calgary, he put together an idea that he was going to invite 6 or 8 architects, and with different points of view from across the country. And we were going to start on one side of the country, and we were going to go to almost all of the schools of architecture and make a little show and try to, explore Canadian culture and explore Canadian architecture and share that with the students. So he organized the whole thing, and we had a bus like for a rock and roll band, and there was beds and almost famous, and there was beds, and there was a TV, satellite, and you could sit down in the living room area and work on your show. And we went from Vancouver all the way to Halifax. So this was his idea of an atlas of ideas, and all the people and all the different places, and the whole idea of helping to generate, because again, on a smaller note, Canada doesn't have, it's very hard for us to have a culture. We're so spread out, there's so few, there's no magazine really one magazine. It's very difficult to have a Canadian architectural culture with such a stretched out, thin country, when the people in the West will associate more with California and things like that, and the people in the East will associate more with Harvard and places like that, or even Nova Scotia is very, very attached to European ideas, and Toronto is like directly associated with Harvard because Toronto is vertical or something. So this idea of his was to try to work across Canada, and so we did go on a crazy bus ride, and he worked out all kinds of details for internet and for publication and for exhibition and whatnot. And here you see the first stop is Vancouver, the second stop was in Calgary, the third stop was in Winnipeg. Then this, for example, right here, this is 2 days of bus, just for your own information. This is 2 days. This is from Winnipeg to Toronto, going all the way across Ontario. It's not 2 days non-stop, but it's 2 days for the bus driver. It means we had to stop and sleep somewhere. and then Waterloo, Toronto, Carleton in Ottawa, then McGill in Montreal, and then another very long drive to Halifax, where we terminated the series of talks. So it was quite an interesting thing. I thought just a funny kind of resemblance to this whole conversation. They did things like built an inflatable presentation screen, and so every stop this thing came out of the trunk, and it was blown up, and it was the show. So they had a lot of fun organizing the whole structure. And here you see one of the first. This was in Winnipeg, a beautiful evening, and we were outside presenting. This is Mark. This is Mark Boutin, who organized the whole event. There's Neil. That was interesting. That's me. So I thought that was an interesting anecdote. So now I'm going to finish with two projects. These are very old projects, but again, they kind of come full circle from the theme of tonight's talks. We won a competition in the 90s. In the 90s, in various communities in Quebec. There's not very many competitions. We were talking about this yesterday with Fabiano in Brasilia, and he was saying that you also don't have very many. We have very few. But in the 90s, the only thing that's going for Quebec is in Quebec, the Minister of Culture has adopted a law that projects that they build need to go through a competition process. Unfortunately, Minister of Culture is a very, very small builder, but at least there's that. And that's only in Quebec. The rest of Canada, it's practically zero. Anyway, in the 90s, the Minister of Culture was supporting communities that had particular stories to tell, and those places of interest that tourists might find along the way. We call them interpretation centers. It's like a museum, but it's specifically for a story about that place that had happened in the past. So in this case, the funny thing is, we did a competition which was based on whaling. The Basque people from Portugal, from Spain and France, the Basque people came to North America in the 16th century, not to settle, but to take whales, blubber and whatnot back to, or the oil, back to Europe. And this community that we, in a place called Trois Pistoles, Quebec, Montreal is here. This is about 600 kilometers away. And then the next project, I don't have the map, but the next project is going to be here in the Gaspé region of Quebec. The local community wanted to create a small museum. There's nothing really there to show. There are some on an island across from the town. There are the pits where they burn the blubber, but there's no real artifact. There's no structures. There's nothing to show except to try to tell the story. So basically, we won a competition to build a building that tells the story of the Basque coming to Quebec to do whale hunting. This map shows, this is Newfoundland that you saw the project earlier. So quite a ways into Quebec. If you remember, Fogo Island was out here. So the Basque whalers came into the estuary of the St. Lawrence to get the whales, because the whales basically went up to do their to have their babies and whatnot. So this was a place that they could catch them in a rather narrower part of the St. Lawrence. And they came on these boats, and they went out in these sort of smaller boats, and it was a kind of a nasty scene, as you can imagine. The hunting, the spears, and whatnot. There's all historical paintings and whatnot showing what was going on. The Indians actually, they were actually in some ways relatively friendly with the Indians. They exchanged North America, the Europeans exchanged items and took back things from the Indians to Europe. So we had this interesting dilemmas in a place, this is a detail, I'll come back to this a little bit later, a close-up of a drawing of a whale, and because of the project we get to kind of look at things like that. Very interesting, when a whale takes in water, it has this kind of system of, it's called baleen. It's a system of filter. It filters out and catches all of the fish and algae, things that it wants to eat, and it keeps it for eating and spits back the water. We'll come back to why I mention this. The other thing that absolutely nothing to do with, obviously, to do with whales, was that the promoter of the competition wanted to extend a broader kind of cultural exchange with the Basque people, and decided that in the program they would talk about pelot. Pelot is a game that's a little bit like a handball kind of a game. You might know it. I don't know if you play that here. You know, in Miami they play highlight, which is a derivation of this game where they have a kind of a scoop, and you throw the scoop allows you to really throw the ball hard and fast, and it bounces off the wall, and the other guy has to catch it and do the same thing. So basically they wanted, it's called a pelot wall, and it's a game that they play in the Basque Country. So they wanted to bring this over and add it to the whole cultural center and create something that becomes a bit more of an element that they can exchange and create an event in the summer and whatnot. So in this place, again, another winter landscape, and this time not nearly as attractive of some of the other ones you saw. A kind of woe-begotten Quebec town, not very interesting. The Trois-Pistoles has a beautiful church up on in the town, but here we are kind of on a road that goes down to the water. It's not very interesting, other than the fact that there is a nice slope to it. So on this relatively uninteresting site, we had to come up with a story to create a little building for the interpretation center. So when we start out, we generally work with, we call them doodles. We sketch little plans. A lot of plan doodles, what I call the site plans. I'm sure you work in a similar fashion. Looking for the right combination. This was the woods. That was the road you just saw. And we try to work with kind of the main elements of the project and get a sense of how this all might work out. Before we really get into the details, in this case, the building, I think, was maybe this blue thing. This was I don't know what, parking maybe, and this was maybe the pelot. But we're just struggling to work out the 2 or 3 main elements of the program. So you'll see a few variations on the theme, the street, a kind of a building starting to take shape where we decided that we were going to make a building that was like a whale, looking for some way to attach ourselves because there's nothing really in this landscape to adhere to in any kind of urban way. And the story of the Basques, they had proposed that you look at a Basque house. We weren't really that interested in Basque architecture, so we thought we would work more with the story of what was this whole story about. The story was about the whales, the story was about the fishermen or the whalers, and the story was about this new public space, which was the pelot court, and of course the ubiquitous parking. And so how the 3 of these things could come together with the woods and maybe create a project. So again, a series of elements moving around, trying to find a logical way of setting up parking, building, palot, parking, building, palot, parking, palot, building. You know, do you put the, how do you interpret this palot court? We thought, well, maybe the palot court was sort of like a little plaza because you're not going to play all the time. So, you know, kids from the neighborhood could come over and play tennis. And in Canada, you play tennis against the wall at school sometimes when you have nothing to do. Just trying to create a scenario from parking, palot to building. And finally, the scenario that we started to feel the most comfortable with was the road, the parking, the palot, maybe behind some sort of screen, and the building. So the public could slide in, use the palot court, or guests, visitors from out of town, could park. Another version, similar. And finally, this idea, this kind of a boat, the public space and the building, the parking. So the visitors go through the boat, into the public space, and then into the building. Becomes the scenario where this kind of boat structure acts as a sign. It's functionless other than maybe for picnicking and for watching the palot game, the palot wall, used to kind of define a public space. The street is here. And the competition drawings, parking, the sort of boat, public space, the entrance to the building is protected by the kind of the whale, and this structure starts to service entry on the back, and a kind of a play area where at a kind of smaller scale the same story is told. Small boat, play area for the kids, a kind of whale to play on. So the story is told many times in many different scales. We were just talking about sections. It's very hard to get the students to work with sections. We love to work with sections. In this series of drawings, how do you make a section of a whale? What is the shape of the whale's, the ribs, for example? Oops. And what are the kind of things that you can do inside of that section in the various types of spaces? How do you create an exhibition inside of that space? And the visitor, what they see outside in that landscape. So one of the things we do in our project, you'll see it a bit today, you'll see it even more tomorrow and on Wednesday, is we try to understand our project in a series of almost like a kit of parts, how the project is made from the items that lie on the ground to the volumes that are the programmatic elements, to the structure, and to the envelope. So the whale is this kind of blue skin, the structure, a mezzanine that you'll see soon is hanging out over the public space and the entrance, and the various programmatic elements that slide in and become, in a way, like the organs of the body of the whale. The entrance, facilities, a little cafe. It's a very, very simple building. There's not much in terms of complexity. You come in, buy your ticket, and you go into this exhibition space. Unfortunately, we didn't get to do the exhibition, so I won't show you any pictures of that. A little classroom at the end of the space, and then behind, on a corridor alongside, is the administration and the lunchroom and the back entrance for the service. So a relatively sophisticated small plan for a very, very simple program, and then a mezzanine up a stair where they have a historical center which will look out over top of the palot and look out. From here you can see the St. Lawrence River. And that same, coming back to the section, so we see the three various situations in the section. The section stays the same. It's the same section, even though it's curving, like moving a little bit like a whale, but it's always the same section. It just changes heights. So the entrance court, covered space outside, that historical room hanging out over the entrance. Then when you're inside, the cafe is a double height space, and that mezzanine, and then into the exhibition room with the administration on the other side of this wall. Close-up of that section at the entrance. And then from the parking, this boat-like element becomes a screen with a sign, and you go through it. So it's very theatrical. You go through this wall to enter into the realm. Now you remember the story of the baleen? Well, we tried to make a structure that resembled this stuff in his mouth. In the end, the structure doesn't look like that, but that's the idea behind the hanging space over the lobby, over the entry. This is a wood structure outside, basically is the fence. You go through it. It's a picnic tables and seating to watch the game. Of course, we didn't understand Palat very well. They've torn all this stuff down because the players fly sideways. They need more room. They don't need to have pieces of wood in their way. Model. That's actually, the picture is backwards. Another model. And there's my partner Howard, many years ago. And here's construction in minus 40. These steel guys, this was terrible weather, but these guys worked they were hanging there, welding and bolting together the steel structure in a very, very, very cold weather. This is a perspective for the competition. This is the idea of the view. So this idea that you tell a story at the big scale and then you come back and the story kind of repeats itself in another scale for the kids, where there's a play structure of a boat. There's a whale you'll see in a few minutes that we built for a slide. And as you come down this street, the blue whale starts to come out of the water, come out of the ground. And the idea is not very truthful, but the idea was this bluish grass. It's not very blue, but the idea was that the other thing that's funny, and this is in both of these projects, you'll see this, and you probably have a similar situation in your projects, is of course we wanted this to be wild grass, long and blowing, but people in the country, they like to cut the grass. People don't understand that you want to have this object coming out of this wild, natural surface. They just want to keep it nice and clean. And there's two projects you'll see tonight, both exactly the same thing happened. So the sign is kind of a wave in the ground. It's a very inexpensive building. The main gesture is the big structure. It's an interesting story about getting this structure built, because this was actually a very, very heavy. This room was going to be very heavy. This room was going to be the local historical society's archive. So we realized that we had built this cantilever over the public space outside, and it was full of books. So the engineer said, well, this is, okay, so we'll move the books. Well, then he came to a meeting very, very late in the game, and he said, guys, this is still not working. We took the books out. Anyway, he wanted to put, you've probably met engineers before, he wanted to put a post here. We don't have a picture of it there. He wanted to put a post right here. And I said, but we had a meeting and we have this big structure. You can't see it in this picture. There's a huge V shape here. And I thought that the V shape, when you were just talking about the big truss, would be able to hold this big truss. He said, no, I need more help. So I said, okay, if the room is like that, What happens if I put a coffee cup? Oh, okay, that's good. So instead of a coffee cup, we have a Basque flag. And he took that and used the flag. We basically built a Basque flag out of steel posts and beams and tried to hide it underneath the structure. Here's the wall that you go through. This is an art piece that was a competition afterwards. And here they are playing Pilote. This is the play area for the kids, the covered area for the entrance. That's my son, many years ago. And that space inside with the structure, the roof, the walls, all made from the same envelope of steel. And the programmatic elements that don't quite touch. A few years earlier, actually, a similar kind of competition, but in this case, an even more remote site in the Gaspé. The Gaspé is basically the furthest extension to the east of Quebec into the Atlantic. And there's, again, some fabulous landscape. This is Percé Rock. It's called Percé Rock. You've probably seen it. You'll see a few other images. You might have seen it. Is very close to this site. And it's a fabulous rock. You can, when the water's down, you can walk out to this opening. Very, very beautiful rock. And this is very close to the site. What was interesting in this case, we considered this the end of the road. This was really for us as far as you could go. It was 1,000 kilometers, 1,100 kilometers from Montreal. And we won this competition. What was interesting about the competition is compared to other projects is the brief was very interesting in that the building was for the summer. So it was a festive building just for tourism in the summer. In the winter, it was closed up. So it already had a brief that was unique. And the second thing that's very unique was that these people, as opposed to the one in Trois Pistoles, this client allowed the historical story, the how you tell the story, to be open to the competition. In other words, typically what happens in a building like that, there'll be an architect, and then some other people will come into what we call a black box, and they'll make a presentation, they'll tell you the story. In this case, they allowed the architects in the competition to suggest how that story was going to be told. And that was very important to us. So the 2 points. One, that it's for the summer. Two, that we could tell the story is part of the architecture. Uh-oh. What happened? Oh. Okay. We lost something, but it's not bad. That doesn't matter. So we've now moved to the site. The site is a point of land with what's called a sandbank and a little island. The French settled here, and they had a community that fished for the cod. And what they did was they set out all kinds of structures to dry the cod. So this community basically settled on this point and used it as a kind of way to control a huge area of fishing. Nowadays there's a train track going across it. A very cute little beach. It's cold, the water, very cold, but a nice little beach. So basically we have this landscape, and again we have nothing really to show. There's no house, there's no structures, there's some, you'll see in a second, there's some, we lost some. What have we lost? Oh, maybe we will. I just want to see what we... Okay, anyway, I don't know what we've lost. Maybe we lost... I might have had... They might be in the wrong format. Okay, anyway, so you saw the site, and I'm jumping around because I don't know what we lost. This is a piece of land art by, I think by Robert Smithson. I'm not 100% sure. But it's a fantastically simple demonstration of a sort of a gesture in the landscape. The reason I'm showing this is because in that site that you saw, it seemed like the program was this big, and the site was this big. And it seemed to us that fundamentally we needed to find a way to do something significant at the scale of that landscape that was well beyond what the program could handle. And that, I think, was the challenge as well. So there were some early efforts of trying to figure out how to deal with the site, in the sense that what I didn't mention was because the railroad is there, but also the access to the site, the road was along the railroad. So the story, a little bit like with the problem that I showed you with the whales, the story is it's going to start here. The story is probably going to start here, and there's that island and the sandbanks. You kind of want to bring people out across that landscape and tell the story. So the first studies show kind of a building and a pathway on that site, and we're looking for a way to manage and create a certain dynamic with that site. Further along, we weren't that happy with the building and the pathway. Further along, we started to fool around with, okay, what if we work with fragments of building along that pathway and start to tell the story of the site as the visitor explores the full length, and then kind of culminate with something that overlooks the island and the sandbanks. So things start to line up along this kind of walkway. On the other side, there's the beach. On this side is the lookout towards the island. And kind of an idea. So here you start to see a little bit of crazy fooling around, because don't forget again, how you tell a story was becoming an issue. In other words, do you go into a room? Do you walk along? Do you explore ruins, etc.? We're starting to ask how we're going to show the story. Well, I'm going to fix that for tomorrow. We'll see if we can make it through this. Probably they were the wrong format for. Anyway, what basically became our method of operation was we said, okay, we're going to create this walkway, and we're going to try to tell the story as you walk along, and we're going to create very, very large murals. So the visitor walks along, and there's a series of paintings that are superimposed on this landscape, as well as, you'll see in a few minutes, a series of gestures that work with the topography. In other words, you're walking across this kind of small change of level, and when it changes level, we introduce this thing that we called a court of precious objects. We'll get to eventually a terrace with a restaurant. The restaurant overlooks that court. This is the competition perspective. The visitors walk along. You're in an outdoor structure. Again, we're coming back to that story about the summer and the winter. What we proposed was that the structure opens up in the summer, and then the structure is going to close down. You'll see in some of the images, the structure completely protects itself in the winter. This is an early drawing. The idea that the architecture works with the landscape, in this case the courtyard is cut, and the large paintings are on these walls that move, and these walls in the winter close to close down the space. This is the restaurant. There's a small little exhibition room at the far end where you actually get to see, and what we did was we cut these little niches in the wall, and you can see there's a few things that are there. There are some pipes and some knives, some plates, the few small precious objects that remained, we put in these niches in the wall. I'm a bit disappointed with the pictures. Yeah, this is. I wonder if there's a way. Is there a computer there? Let's just see. This is the site, but we'll see. We'll see what we have. This is the site plan for the competition. So the cars arrive, a parking lot, and you are greeted by, you'll see it later, you're greeted by a sort of sign, and you start walking under this, basically this roof. So the story is being told as you're walking across, and then you end up, either you go down into this courtyard, or you go up onto the terrace and overlook the site. And the building, finally, as built, very simple shed-like structure with the panels, an administration building at the beginning where you pay for you buy your ticket. Everything is like built on the site as if they're separate objects. Even the ramp is brought in as a big steel bent plate, set down on the ground, brings you up onto a wooden platform, and then you go back down onto the ground. The paintings, graphic design, friends of ours did the graphic design. The idea was, again, because, in a way, a criticism of the black box, because all you had left was the story and the real landscape that exists. We had the paintings done on perforated aluminum. So when you're looking at the story, you're looking at the landscape at the same time. There's some very interesting structural moments. That's the big wall that's cut. Whoops, the big wall that's cut into the ground, and one of the major cross bracings in the shed. The shed is a very, very simple shape, and it only has cross bracing possible at the two ends because it's about 80 meters long. It needs something in the middle, and there's this very interesting moment where we came up with the engineer to make a kind of a V structure that goes up and grabs, basically sits on the wall and goes up on an angle and grabs the underside of the structure. So here's one of the most beautiful painting, giant codfish. You're seeing through the landscape, the railway bridge, and the story is told on these panels. The restaurant, the small exhibition room at the end, the niches, niche. What is niche in English? Niche in English. Yeah, niche. Is niche good? Yeah. So these are very special. They're nice. They have lights inside, and these flaps. The story is on. This is coming again back to how the story is told. The panels, the niches. This is how we convince the client that that's how the story will be told. The only little room left at the end is a traditional exhibition room for changing exhibitions, for other kinds of events. These flaps in the winter, they close the flap to the top. These panels, they close this way, and there's a big marquise that drops down and closes. This is a little restaurant. A fun thing, you might not know what this is. Well, it's acting as a post. It's a post. But a little bit like the Basque flag, it doesn't look like a post. It's actually a fireplace for the restaurant. But, you know, it's an overscale. It's a bit of a pop post in a way. It's for sewers. I don't know if you use that here to make aqueduct and in the ground. You know what I mean? This is for water and drainage at a very, very big scale. This is a pipe that's made industrially. This is not what it's for. This is basically what I'm trying to say. We like to work with the structure, cross-bracing, working with very, very ordinary materials. This is a plywood that's used to resist water. It's water protected plywood. There's this very, very cheap wood that we call It's called particle board. It's big pieces of wood. It's very, very cheap, but it's a beautiful look to it, but it's very, very cheap. If you show it to a client, they will be very insulted. But I've built floors in my house out of it, and it's very, very beautiful structure. Again, we have fun with the bracing, with the ramp going up across the round tubes. Here it is closed for the end of season. Detail of a painting. Rainy season. This is also a very, very inexpensive kind of floor. Beautiful. This is cedar, but each of the materials is chosen kind of in a iconoclastic way to bother people in a way. This has got the knots. People like it without the knots, but the knots are kind of like what people used to have in their basement. It's a kind of a rhetorical use of the material, but it's quite beautiful. It's a naughty cedar. So it's less valuable, but it's quite beautiful, the texture. So here you are with that floor and the wall made of that same material, the fireplace. The cross bracing, we would look to try to do things with the cross bracing. You'll see again on Wednesday, use of cross bracing. Somewhere along the line we learned that cross bracing doesn't have to be a thin wire. Everybody said in school, and the engineers, they always propose a thin wire, but we like it to be strong, and when it's a tube, you can make shapes that are stronger and more interesting, I think. So here's the marquise in the summer. That in the winter it closes down and shuts the whole place up like a steel can. And this is basically the entrance sign with a garage behind it.